Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to the sixth Moggcast. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, at the beginning of all these Moggcasts, Jacob, I say we must have a break from Brexit this week, and then duly fail to provide us with a break from Brexit. But for at least part of this conversation, I'm going to try to, because by the time we sit down again, Easter will have taken place. So I thought we might have a little rummage this week around politics and faith. So I'd start off by asking you about your background. I mean, your Catholicism is very well known. The old crucifix sort of crops up in your Instagram account. I think your faith isn't exactly a secret. Of the Rees-Moggs, are they a traditional Catholic family? Your father was a very devout Catholic who I knew. Was he a big influence on you?
Oh, very much so. My father was a great influence on me in many ways, and his Catholicism, as you rightly say, was very important to him. And Catholicism came into the family through his mother. His mother was an Irish American and came to the UK in about 1920 and married my grandfather then. And my grandfather was an Anglican, never converted. Neither has my mother ever converted. And so the Catholicism is my grandmother, my father, and down to his children.
And you grew up with it and simply accepted it, did you, as sort of something that your father offered to you and you found true?
Yes, that's right. I've never had any doubts, which I know is an unusual thing to say. I haven't had a period when I've wondered whether it's all true. I've always believed it. Even though as a child I did not enjoy going to church. I have some sympathy with my own children who say, "Oh, Daddy, do we have to go to church? None of our friends go to church, and it's so boring." And I felt very much like that when I was...
Yeah, I read somewhere you went off it in your teens.
No, I didn't go off it in my teens.
Oh, right.
I went off it younger than that. I went off it before I really started. Not through any doubts, but just because going to Mass for an hour was boring.
When did it stop being boring?
I can't remember precisely, but I took my first communion late-ish, at about 9. Once I'd taken my first communion, then I was much keener to go.
And you say that you've never had any doubts. I mean, you've never looked at pictures of the atrocities in Syria or thought your way back to the Holocaust or reflected on the slave trade and the horrors of human history and thought there can't be a just God in a world like this?
I think the argument that if there is free will, then inevitably people will choose to sin is a very strong one. I think the harder bit to explain are natural disasters. What is the purpose of them? But that if the ultimate joy is heaven, and this is merely a means of getting to heaven, then a loving God is not condemning in the way that it's sometimes seen. I think, in a way, it's accepting that I have a lack of understanding of the purposes and the mystery of God. And it's why I'm so happy to accept the teaching of the Catholic Church, because it seems to me that in 48 years I cannot challenge the accumulated knowledge of 2,000 years of some of the cleverest people who've ever lived. But even their knowledge is not sufficient to understand the mystery of God's purpose.
Do you sometimes look at the total pronouncements of the Church and just find your eyelids narrowing just a bit cynically when you look at, for example, the Church's general take on politics in the 19th century, on democracy? It's very, very different to the take today, and think that it's no more human or consistent and no less fallible an organisation than any other?
Well, I accept the doctrine of papal infallibility partly because of its limitations. that people think that the Holy Father is infallible, and if he wakes up in the morning and says, "My toast is cold," when it is in fact hot, he is infallible. This is not and never has been the teaching of the Church. Vatican I codifies it and says the Holy Father is infallible when speaking ex cathedra, therefore as the Bishop of Rome, on a matter of faith and morals. So when the Holy Father defined the Assumption, that was a matter of faith and morals, and that was clearly an infallible statement. When the Holy Father says things outside that area, they are an important teaching of a bishop, of the bishop, but they are not infallible. And that is the Church's own teaching. So you must always take what the Pope says seriously, but it is not the official dogma of the Church, except in those very narrowly defined circumstances.
And how seriously do you take the documents that touch particularly on politics, which often on economics have a view that would be very different from yours?
Well, they're there to be considered seriously, but the Church is not trying to come up with a manifesto for a general election, and that's not its purpose. It has to deal with eternal matters less than temporal matters. But this is a tension that has existed between the Church and states for centuries. There's the great medieval debate around the two swords, which always fascinated me, that you take one verse of the Bible and it becomes a discussion for hundreds of years. Which sword is superior? The spiritual sword, which the Church has, or the temporal sword, which rulers have? And in the end, it is established, against the Church's protestations, that the two swords operate separately. And I think that is, the papal bull Unum Sanctum, 1314 or thereabouts, is the high point of papal claims, that all temporal power flows from the Church, that Christ gave the two swords to the Church, and then the Church delegated the second sword to the temporal authority. But that turned out simply not to be the case, and the Church eventually accepted that that was not the case. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't given up its claims for temporal influence entirely.
In fact, from the beginning, in Christianity, there's been a separation between church, in quotes, and state, has there not? Pay unto Caesar what's due to Caesar, pay unto God what's due to God. Then you have a long debate about what exactly falls in those categories. It seems to me, I don't know if you've ever thought about this or delved into it, that this difference isn't so well sustained in Islam, which is a sort of overdog religion. That's to say, it met temporal success very quickly, whereas Christianity is a kind of underdog religion, isn't it? It was underground for 400 years before assuming temporal power.
I mean, it's a very interesting way of looking at it, but the Ottoman Sultan was the head both in a religious and in a temporal sense. He had absolute authority, and that is a very different understanding. And you're quite right that the Christian Church had no temporal power in its early days at all, and it's very interesting how it goes along with the temporal authorities. And if you look at some of the early Christian teachings, can you eat meat that has been sacrificed to the gods? Not if you know, but you don't have to go out of your way to find out. That the Church is trying to make it possible for an unapproved religion to exist.
Is it right that you had a tridentine mass at your wedding?
No, it's not.
It's not. Right. You can put the record straight.
I can put the record straight, but I understand the confusion. We had a New Order Latin Mass, and the reason for that was discussing it with the celebrant. His view was that in an environment where many people aren't used to going to church, if there were long periods of silence, you might find that people started chatting because they simply wouldn't be used to it and they would wonder what on earth was going on. And so it was the New Order Latin.
That clears up what's perhaps a misapprehension, which is that you like doing nothing better than roaming the country looking for a Tridentine Mass, as it's called, to attend.
No, that's not correct. I do go to the Tridentine Rite when it is available near me in Somerset. I don't travel across the country, and the new rite is in all senses valid. It is not a lesser rite, it is not a subsidiary rite.
But does the old one have a particular appeal for you, or does it
yes,
not really?
Yes, it does. And I mean, I like the old rite. I think it is richer, that the texts are fuller. There's a lot of has been taken out for the new rite, that it focuses more centrally on the Eucharist rather than on the other parts of the Mass, which in my view are less central, and it is more thoughtful, that there's more silence, and the New Order can sometimes have quite a lot of background noise.
Silence is a good thing.
Silence is a good thing in church.
And when Jeremy Paxman asked Tony Blair, I'm going to put aside from it the way in which he did it, I'm just going to stick to the question, do you pray? Do you think that was a licit question to ask a senior politician?
Oh, yes, I think it's perfectly reasonable. I think it's perfectly reasonable to ask politicians about their private lives. I don't believe in privacy laws. I think they're a fundamentally rotten idea because I think they lead to the electorate, the British people, being gulled. And I think that all questions are legitimate, but it is then up to the politician to decide how to answer those questions. And I think the electorate is in a sense entitled to information. It needs to know, it wants to know what makes its politicians tick.
How do you pray?
Oh, in a very traditional Catholic way. I say the usual Catholic prayers. I particularly say the Rosary, which, as I have a feeling that not all of your listeners will know, the Rosary is said on a set of beads with 10 Hail Marys, 1 Our Father, 1 Glory Be, and starts with the Apostles' Creed. And a full Rosary is 150 Hail Marys increased by John Paul II to 200. So it depends whether you take the traditional or the modern version, but very few people, other than popes, I imagine, say full 200 Hail Marys every day.
Do you say the Rosary every day?
I try to say the Rosary every day, yes.
So in fact you pray in a structured, only quite traditional form,
yes,
by the sound of it. And you've answered the question about privacy. And let's take another sort of dimension of the matter and ask, to what degree should politicians do God? Alistair Campbell famously interrupted an interviewer during an interview and said, we don't do God, despite the fact that in one way or another Tony Blair in fact did.
Well, I don't aim to do God. I get asked questions that relate to my faith, and I answer the questions that I am asked. I don't see my role as being a proselytizing role or a theological role or a teaching role, but I think one has to admit and bear witness to what one believes. And so, in my case, it is not a political decision one way or another. It is, I'm asked these questions, and I think as a Christian you have an obligation when asked to answer.
You took this position very much when you were asked about abortion. You said, well, this is my view. It's the teaching of the church, and it's my view because I hold the teaching of the church. I'm not trying to impose it on anyone else. But a counter-argument would be, well, hang on a moment, Jacob, if there was a bill before the Commons to cut the number of weeks at which abortion is allowed, you would vote to restrict it. So it's not simply a personal view, it does have public consequences, or could have.
Well, I think the issue really is whether you would try and make it party policy, not whether you would vote one way or another as a matter of conscience. Because the will of Parliament will be determined by what 650 MPs think. But we all know that in most cases, it is not what 650 MPs think, it's what the party bosses have determined. And I think what people are worried about, that somebody who is Catholic might influence the party bosses to make them insist that their religious view became a whipped vote. And that I am very clear I would not seek to do. I think this is a matter for people's consciences. And there is clearly in Parliament no majority for my views on life. But yes, of course, as an individual MP, I would vote in favour of life.
Your critics, or the critics of this argument, might say this is a bit of a straw man, because they would challenge you really to produce anyone who tried to make these matters of conscience subject to a whipped vote.
I think as it happens, it's crucially important, and the Liberal Democrats have made it official party policy, so it would be very difficult for a Lib Dem to vote against abortion. But it's an understanding of how politics works in this country. How do you get the law changed? You don't get the law changed because an MP has an individual view. You get the law changed because it's a matter of party policy. And therefore, without it being party policy, I am one vote among 650. And therefore, people who are in favour of abortion do not need to worry that I'm in a position to change it. Unless the whole country changed their view, but that is a separate question.
You mentioned the Liberal Democrats. In fact, I wanted to ask you a question that was based on what a Liberal Democrat said, if I can find the quote, which sadly I may not be able to, but it came from Tim Farron. I thought Farron's departure from the leadership of the Liberal Democrats really was quite remarkable, in that he came very close to saying that you couldn't be a practicing Christian of his view in his party. I think his words were pretty much, I have found it very difficult to reconcile my faith with my party's view on certain issues. Do you think it's getting tougher for, I'll call it traditional Christians rather than liberal Christians, in public life and in society generally?
I think the Liberal Party is not liberal. Lord Alton left the Liberal Party for exactly the same reason 20 years ago, when it adopted abortion as a party platform at a party conference. So I think Tim Farron was saying something that others have said before him, and it is one of the ironies of public life that the least liberal party, the least tolerant party, is the one that has liberal in its name. In the Conservative Party, I don't think there's any difficulty holding traditional Christian views. I think they still maintain a lot of support, and there are a lot of Christians in Parliament. Likewise, in the Labour Party, there are probably more practicing Catholic Labour MPs than there are Conservative MPs. And I don't go as often as I should, but there's Mass said every week in the Houses of Parliament, and I noticed there that there are many more Labour MPs than there are Conservative MPs.
Do you think it's harder outside politics to propound, or actually even if you were asked, answer questions that show you're a Christian of a certain stamp, that you've got certain views on abortion or same-sex marriage, or that you might want to wear a cross? Is that getting harder, or is this just sort of vulgar tabloid invention?
I don't think it's getting harder. Bear in mind, the rosary beads that I was talking about earlier would have been viewed as practically treason in the reign of Elizabeth I. So
it's getting a bit easier.
In some ways, it's easier. But the British have always been, at least in modern times, very uncomfortable with people wearing their heart on their sleeve. And that has a more general application. And I think people have no objection to religion, but they quite like people to do things privately. And personally, I would keep my religion very private if I weren't asked lots of questions about it.
And do you think it's your responsibility as a public person to answer questions about your private views because that's what you take on when you become a public person?
Well, the issue is the one that we had at the Palm Sunday Mass that poor St. Peter faces. When you're asked the question, you cannot wait for the cock to crow, can you? You have to say what you think. And it would be easier to say nothing. It would be, in a sense, more English to keep quiet. But I think when asked the question, we have a clear duty to answer it.
A quite different sort of question. I'm going to get back to Brexit and finally ask a Brexit question after this little journey into Holy Week and Easter. I think you've written a piece in The Express. Was it today or
it was for Sunday.
For Sunday, saying really in pretty stern terms that the eventual settlement's got to be a lot better than the transition. Can I ask you this, without wanting to be pejorative about it, but again, someone looking at this might well say, look, all you chaps, the ERG, the Brexiteers, the guardians of the flame in Parliament, you huff and you puff, but you have been paper tigers so far. The Prime Minister's gone down this road in transition you don't want her to go down. The role of the ECJ is exactly the same. Free movement will continue. It's really pretty much as though we were still in the EU. And you blow loud, and blow noisy about it, but nothing actually happens. And come the Prime Minister coming back with a deal that's less than perfect, you will vote it through.
Well, time will tell, won't it? The transition deal is deeply unsatisfactory and goes against a number of things that the government was saying until very shortly before the transition deal was agreed would not happen. You are right to view it as essentially remaining in the EU until the end of 2020. And I think that's been a failure of our negotiation. I think it's absurd to try and dress it up as anything other than that. And I don't think the government's particularly trying, actually. I don't think the government is saying this is great success. It's saying this is what we've got to do. But what matters is the end state. There will be no further fob-offs once we know the end state. It will either be that we are leaving or that we remain in. And then we will see whether the referendum result is delivered upon or whether it's watered down. Politically, there is no market for a party that fails to deliver Brexit. It wouldn't, if we delivered a half-cocked Brexit, bring all the Remainers back to thinking, aren't the Tories wonderful? And it would dismay and fail those who voted to leave. So the political imperative for the government is to get to a proper state, and I'm sure the government understands that.
What ground for confidence have you got, given where the government went with transition?
Not an enormous amount. I wish to give the government the benefit of the doubt because I am a loyal Conservative, and the government is saying the things that I want to hear. But I'm very conscious that it has been saying the things I wanted to hear for some time, and we need to see that those are what actually happen.
Do you feel the position has worsened significantly since the agreement that was reached in December? You had reservations about it, but you weren't nearly as voluble as you've been about transition, which suggests to me you didn't think it was as bad, which therefore also suggests to me you think matters have got worse.
No, the issue is not whether this is worse than December. It's an issue of this is more real than December. So December was very theoretical. This is what we are going to do in the next 3 months. This is what will happen, other things being equal, in the 21 months after we have left. So the more solid the government platform becomes, the more necessary it is to examine it in detail and say, well, I'm not in favour of this, I'm not in favour of that, I can live with that. And I can live with this transition on the condition that it leads to what the government is promising. And I am more confident than I'm not confident than the government will deliver on this, because I think it would be almost impossible for it not to. But the government will come under great pressure, and it needs to be resolute.
on the one hand, you're expressing confidence things will get better. On the other hand, you're also saying the more solid the position's got, the worse it's got.
Well, I think if you want to defend the government position, there has been a mismatch between the briefing and the reality, and that the government, looking back, understands that the transition was never going to be something anybody would like. And they made a mistake in not saying that more clearly, that the transition is an extension of the status quo, and the government implied that the transition would be different. And that has turned out to have been a pious hope. But it is the end state that matters ultimately. But no, I think I've made absolutely no bones about the transition being unsatisfactory, not a good deal, and for 21 months we are the vassal state.
Why aren't more pro-Brexit MPs? The ERG's probably got a compass of about 80 people, being as voluble about it as you are. Some are. I mean, John Redwood's not entirely happy and Duncan Smith's not entirely happy. I'm not hearing, or conscious of hearing, new voices saying what you're saying.
Well, what I would say about the ERG is, what is the point of having a dog and barking yourself? In that sense, I am the dog.
Not the lion's roar, the dog's bark, in this case.
I'm merely a backbench member of Parliament. And I can't tell you what people have said to me confidentially or what has been discussed in our private meetings. But I think it would not be unfair for me to say that my view is probably softer than that of many Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party, rather than harsher.
Well, on that growling note, we will end the Moggcast. And I wish you, of course, a very happy Easter, as I do to all our listeners.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I should like to do the same and say this has gone from the Moggcast to the Dogcast.
The headline is almost irresistible. I will try to resist it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.